Hi, I'm Dianna Anderson, and welcome to episode 13 of How Do I Lead Now? In this episode, we're going to talk about how to create change in complex situations. So, we talked last week about patterns and the idea that as our world gets more complex and complicated, that it's far more impactful to step back and see how things connect and intertwine to create outcomes. So, this week, what we want to talk about is how do you begin to work with patterns of complexity and in order to make some change with them. I think the first thing that you've got to do is let go of this idea that you're going to fix something. That's kind of an old traditional approach to leadership and to change that works when things are really well contained and confined. But in situations where there's a lot of inputs and a lot of possible outcomes, we're far better to think about influencing and not thinking about change as an end product, as in it's going to be done, but more like moving something in a direction to attain an outcome. And so to attain this kind of change, I think one of the first things you want to think about is what is the intention for the overall change? So in an earlier episode, we talked about the difference between setting goals versus setting intentions. And I think to go through the long haul of influencing a system and really creating lasting but more complex change, we need to set intentions that inspire people to bring their creativity and the best that they have to offer to the outcome. The other thing is, as we go along, we're going to have to keep making decisions. We're going to have to make one decision after another. We're not going to plot a straight path to get to this outcome. And so if we're clear on what our intention is, it helps us to make those little interim decisions as we go along and kind of keep course correcting with something to guide us. So setting clear intentions for an outcome is really important. I think the next thing to really think about is kind of getting to this idea that there's not a set pattern. I think it helps to think about complex change as a little bit like untying a whole pile of knots. If you think about it, let's say you have a garden hose, or you've got maybe a necklace, and there's not just one knot in them, but there's a bunch, and you've got to figure out where to begin. And in that way, you would probably step back and look at the whole thing, or as much of it as you can see, and decide where the best place to begin would be. I think a similar kind of thinking really works well when we're thinking about changing anything that is complex. So step way back first. Really see as much of this as you can see. Think about what influences what. And then decide, where do you want to focus your attention? What significant change is going to result in much more comprehensive change, make the biggest difference? So I always ask, what's the one thing that we could change that will get the biggest return for that amount of effort? Let's see where things fall out from that, and then let's choose what we're going to change next. As an example, I know when I work with leaders, again, certainly a smaller scale, but I can always find one compelling assumption or belief that's really informing a lot of the choices that leader is making. And often if I can help that person to see something differently, then they will actually change all of their behavior. So the most example you've heard me use before, but I think it's really compelling, is if I can help a leader through coaching to see that changing their leadership style, moving from telling people what to do all the time to actually inspiring and influencing them, is going to help them be more successful in a way that's meaningful to them, they'll put the effort into making the change. The same is true in systems. I find that there's usually some underlying assumptions or beliefs that are driving a lot of the choices that are being made. When we step back, we can see them. And often the thing that we're going to leverage or focus on changing is actually an assumption or a belief. And it's important to know that you're not going to change that with logic. You're not going to change it with data. You can use all that stuff to reinforce a new assumption or belief, but it is through experience. It is by seeing something from a different perspective, by being able to experience something in a new way, that we change both our hearts and our minds. And as we've talked about in other episodes, it's our heart we want to change first, actually, and the mind will typically follow. So when we're looking at how to influence a system, helping people see how they and everyone else, but particularly them, are going to benefit from the change is often the impetus to help people actually decide to get behind whatever's going on. So think about what's the story about how things are going to be different if this assumption or belief is changed, and how's that going to benefit not only that one person, but a collective group of people. And getting really good at telling those stories, I think, is a really key leadership skill that you need in order to influence systems. And then the last thing I would tell you or encourage you to think about is how do you make it safe to make the little change that we're talking about, or that first change. So don't worry about explaining all of the rest of it. Safety first. If people do not feel safe, they will not take the risk to change. So really give thought to when you're proposing a change, how can you help people feel as safe as possible in making that first initial change? And let's get that solidified, and be ground we can stand on, whatever that might be, whether it's new skills to stand on or a new outcome that feels solid. Let's focus on getting some solid ground to build on again. Again, we need a system of change to change a system. And we've got to have stepping stones that feel like we can catch our breath before we risk taking the next one. So these are some thoughts on how to actually change a system, whatever that might be for you. I hope that you'll take some time to ponder where this kind of thinking might actually help you maybe be more effective at having greater influence and being able to guide greater changes in whatever way is meaningful for you. So that's your reflection for this week. Is there something big that you'd like to influence? A question maybe that you're in, or maybe an issue that has arisen over the last few months that's meaningful to you, that you can't quite get your head around how to change. Give thought to whether approaching that question or that issue in the way that I've described might help you see a few more leverage points for change than maybe have occurred to you so far. So, as always, I'd love to hear from you, what you're changing, how this is working out, questions that you might have. I hope that you choose something really meaty and meaningful to play with, because the world needs that right now. So, and I hope you'll join me again next week for our episode 14, where I want to talk about the problem with perfection and why that gets in our way. So I hope that you'll join me for that conversation. Until then, have a fantastic week. Thanks so much.